Hello, and welcome to this special World We Got This live podcast, Lockdown Spaces, Why Environment Matters to Mental Health. A quick note before we get started. My name's James Bagley from the School of Global Affairs. I'm going to try and stay as quiet as possible during this, mainly because we want to hear from our fantastic panel, but also because we've got building work going on outside, so apologies if you hear that come through, but as I say, I'll try and mute myself wherever possible. So a quick note about the event. So this podcast is co-hosted by the Centre for Society and Mental Health here at Global Health, here at the School of Global Affairs at King's, as well as the Department for Geography. The Centre for Society and Mental Health helps explore today's changing world and taps into the social factors that shape and promote mental health. Today's format will be as follows. We're going to hear from each of our panelists, who I'll speak about briefly in a moment, for 5 minutes each, and we're going to hear about various things that they've brought to today's panel. And then we're going to have a open discussion for 20 minutes where I'll be able to follow up with some follow-up questions and discussions around what we're discussing today. And then finally, we're going to have a live Q&A from you, the audience. We've had some questions sent in already, and I know we're going to be monitoring social media, but please do send them in here live on Zoom if you're watching. Or on YouTube, and we can answer those in that final 20 minutes. So do get thinking about this. One final thing, please do share. We sent out a message ahead of this event to share your lockdown spaces. So maybe it's a garden or a park or a window box that's helped you through the lockdown. So you can share those at KCL Geography. Hashtag lockdown spaces, lockdown space, sorry, and our colleagues will be sharing those live on Twitter. So I just want to briefly introduce our panel, and then I'll go to our first speaker. First of all, we have a special guest, Dr Sue Stuart-Smith. Sue is a psychiatrist and psychotherapist. For 13 years, she worked as a consultant in Herefordshire, where she became lead clinical... Hertfordshire, sorry.
All right, don't worry.
Hertfordshire, where she became lead clinician for adult psychotherapy. Following her retirement from the NHS, she has specialised in physician health and is Deputy Director of Doc Health Services, run by the British Medical Association here in London. Her book, we're going to be speaking about today in this discussion, The Well-Gardened Mind, explores the healing and empowering effects of working with nature, particularly for people suffering from trauma, depression, and displacement. Her research has brought her all over the world, but also to projects here in the UK. Our second speaker is Dr. Helen Fisher. Helen is a reader in developmental psychopathology within the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience here at King's. She is also part of the Centre for Society and Mental Health, one of today's co-sponsors. And finally, we have Dr. Margaret Kadiri, teaching fellow in physical geography in the Department of Geography here at King's. Prior to this, Margaret was over at LSE, and her work and what she's going to be speaking about today relates to climate change and renewable energy. So I'm just going to bring us to our first speaker that I'd like to introduce, Dr. Sue Stuart-Smith.
Very pleased to be here. Thank you, James. I'm just going to hold up the book, a little book plug. So this is The Well-Gardened Mind, which came out in April, right in the middle of lockdown. So, and one of the interesting things is having written in the book about how people, how throughout history, people need to turn back to nature at times of crisis. And in the book, I'd looked at the First World War in particular, but also other research into after natural disasters and after sort of financial crises, we return to the land and we return to the sense that we recover a sense that ultimately it's the earth that sustains us. And it felt very uncanny, actually, as I launched this book, and I was doing this myself, buying more seeds than normal, sowing, getting more involved. I mean, I grow lots of vegetables anyway, but I was getting much more involved with it. And actually, I realized I had my own experience of the psychological importance of it with the little tomato plants I had growing on my windowsill inside the house. I would look at them first thing in the morning before I ever looked at the news. So I think this phenomenon that we saw, and it really was very marked, people did rush and buy seeds. They became very difficult to get hold of. People who'd never gardened before were beginning to think about gardening. People started to really appreciate the gardens they had as well. And there was a growing awareness as time went on that actually lockdown was an immeasurably much harder experience for people who didn't have access to outdoor space. And I think there's a lot to think about here. One of the things that struck me with my tomato plants was something that I have written about in the book, which was how when we work with natural growth, it gives us a way of thinking about the future. And when lockdown started, we all had to cancel plans. The future was very, very uncertain. It still is, but it's less acute, that feeling now. There was a real sense of fear. And this is an effect that people can experience in other situations when they've had a mental breakdown. We saw it, you could see it in history in the trenches in the First World War, when soldiers wrote home asking for seeds to be sent out, and they created gardens, some of them right on the front line, on the back wall of the trenches. This is very stabilizing. And it just gives us a toehold into the future, if you like. And it's a kind of future that we can imagine, the lettuces that we're going to grow or whatever, when everything else is so very, very uncertain. So I think that this has actually been given a name as well by a socio-ecologist called Keith Tidball, who's American, who's published a book called Greening in the Red Zone. And he refers to it as urgent biophilia. And there's no question that at the beginning of the COVID crisis, and to some extent continuing now, if you look on social media, we are all experiencing that. And I think it's been intensified because there's one unique thing about this crisis, which is, compared to, let's say, historical crises that I've just mentioned, which is the lack of human contact that we've been able, we're doing everything through screens, apart from our own small families. I know we're coming out of it now, but it's still very uncertain, and we're having to keep distance. So all those aspects of human relating and social support that help people get through times of extreme stress and uncertainty were also taken away. And I think it revealed to us in a very powerful way how at a fundamental level, how important nature is, how much companionship we can find in nature, in our gardens, our parks, in our trees, and how much caring for, care matters, that actually through caring for a garden, this is a very, it relieves stress, partly through the release of endorphins. So there are many, many ways. I mean, I could talk. I think I'm running out of my time, so I'm going to stop, but I look forward to saying more later on.
No, that's wonderful too. We've got lots to discuss, but definitely we've been just talking about this at King's, and various different people that have sent questions in. They've definitely been a kind of uptick in people finding garden as or kind of nature as being a key factor in how they've got through lockdown. So it's really a fascinating time to discuss your book, such a timely moment. That's wonderful. So if I can now bring in Helen, and her 5 minutes.
Great. So thanks so much for the opportunity to join the discussion today. I'm really delighted to be here on behalf of the ESRC Centre for Society and Mental Health at King's. So just as Sue was mentioning, there's been so many benefits, I think, during the lockdown for green space, and where people have been able to access that. And there's certainly a growing body of scientific evidence that regular exposure to natural aspects of the environment, such as green space, but also blue spaces, so lakes and other bodies of water, can be really beneficial for our cognitive functioning and also our emotional well-being, as well as obviously our physical health. So, for instance, there have been numerous studies that have reported children who grow up in neighbourhoods with more leafy green vegetation do much better on cognitive and academic tests. So it's important, though, to think about that in terms of what else is happening with those children. So certainly one of my colleagues, Aaron Rubin, suggests that actually in the UK, it may actually just be that wealthier families tend to live in neighbourhoods with more greenery, and they also provide other advantages to their children to boost their cognitive development. However, on the mental health side, there have been quite a large number of studies, particularly in Denmark, and in fact some studies have come out recently of the whole of the Danish population, where they have amazing records. And they found that children who grew up in areas with more green spaces had a lower risk of developing quite a wide range of mental health disorders in adulthood, even when they took into account poverty, living in an urban or rural area, and parental mental illness. And they also found that the rates of mental health problems were lowest amongst children who had lived in the greener neighbourhoods for a longer period of time compared to those who just lived in them for a year. So it really suggests a cumulative effect of exposure to green space on our mental health. And another study of that Danish population also found that growing up in areas near blue spaces, such as lakes or seas, and green spaces or farming lands, had lower rates of, the kids had lower rates of schizophrenia when they got to adulthood. And as Sue was alluding to, and we can talk about a bit more later, it could be that these green and blue spaces really help us to relax, reduce our stress levels, encourage us to exercise, or simply perhaps to be more sociable and feel less isolated, which can all really provide a boost to our mental well-being. The important thing I wanted to kind of bring to the table today was that not everyone has been able to reap the benefits of gardening and outdoor spaces during this lockdown period. Many people who are on lower incomes, particularly those living in large cities, often reside in high-rise flats or apartment blocks and have no access to green space personally. And they're also therefore clearly disadvantaged, particularly early in lockdown, when a lot of the local parks and the gardens owned by the National Trust, for instance, were shut, and you were only allowed to kind of access these public green spaces briefly while exercising, and certainly could risk a fine if you stopped to try and smell the roses in those parks. So this has been also problematic for people who were told to shield and couldn't leave their homes at all if they didn't have their own garden or window box to tend. Similarly, people with disabilities would also have not been able to access some outdoor spaces during the lockdown. For instance, they might not have been able to take public transport to get to parks, or to have somebody with them, for instance, if they were blind, to support them due to the issues with social distancing. Also, a lot of people who were in lower paid jobs had to continue to go to work, and they may not have had as much time as those who were working from home to spend outdoors and benefit from green space. And these are really big issues, because we know that people from disadvantaged backgrounds, those who are socially isolated and those with pre-existing disabilities, are more likely to experience mental health issues, and therefore this lack of access to green space during lockdown may well have increased these inequalities in mental health further. And this is certainly something we're keen to explore in the future within the centre. I also wanted to touch on another aspect of our environment that is a particular focus for the centre and my work, which is actually the communities we live in. So the social aspects, if you like, of our neighbourhoods, such as our sense of community spirit, or being able to rely on our neighbours for help if we have a problem, or look after our Amazon delivery or something for us, and feeling safe in our local area. And all of those have also been shown to be beneficial for our mental health. So Eloise Crush from my team, for instance, has found that children living in an area with supportive neighbours were less likely to develop mental health problems such as paranoia or hearing voices, even when they had experienced severe victimisation. So that who is around us in our environment is also important. And I wonder if perhaps for some people, lockdown has really highlighted how important our local community is, in terms of having neighbours who could do shopping for people who were shielding or unwell, as well as perhaps that kind of emotional boost or feeling of solidarity that came when we came out on a Thursday and saw our neighbours clapping on the doorstep for key workers. On the flip side of that, obviously, it may also have made other people acutely aware of how unpleasant, difficult, or unsupportive the neighbours were, which might have left them feeling lonely or afraid, and thus also perhaps increasing the likelihood of them experiencing mental health problems. So finally, I just wanted to turn back to green spaces and raise that the benefits of these might not be universal. So certainly from what we've heard from Sue and what I've talked about with the research, they are potentially for many people, but not everybody. Some people might find being in a park around other people stressful, particularly at present, as lockdown is easing and other people may not be observing social distancing, we might get more anxious about that. And people might be fearful that, with lots of trees and other things, that people could be hiding to potentially attract them, or because some parks might be known for drug dealing or other crimes. And it's also important, just thinking about the next talk, to think about the fact that being outside is not always good for us. And exercising outside with high levels of air pollution, for instance, would increase the likelihood of us inhaling particles and gases which could damage our lungs, leading to physical health issues, but have also been shown to have an impact on how our brain develops and functions, and therefore could affect our mental health. So Joanne Newbury and Susanna Roberts from my team have shown that children and adolescents exposed to high levels of air pollution outdoors were at greater risk of developing depression and psychotic experiences, such as hearing voices, as they made the transition to adulthood. So thankfully, the levels of air pollutants have, particularly some of them like nitrogen dioxide, may have gone down during lockdown, which is fantastic, and so it's a bit of a less of a concern. But I'm sure, as the next speaker will say, as things start opening up, we might expect some increases in traffic-related pollutants and some problems again with our access to outdoor space. So I'll stop there and pass on to Dr. Kadiri.
That's great, Helen. It's fantastic, and I think that's one thing we've heard from the centre, as you say, about the inequalities kind of on show during the crisis and how that kind of manifests itself. And on this topic, as you say, in terms of access to green space, it's really key. So it'd be interesting to perhaps speak about that more in the panel. Thinking of healing and some of the topics we've spoken about today, I'm going to hand over to Margaret, who I know is going to speak about how we've perhaps seen in this period some healing in terms of the planet itself, and I know there's been a lot of discussion about that. So I'll hand over to Margaret to give more on that.
Thanks, James. Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to start by pointing out some of the things that Sue and Helen have spoken about. So they both talked about how nature and the environment plays a key role in our physical and mental well-being. And I believe this shows that nature and the environment are deeply and directly connected to our well-being. And this makes it imperative that we need to protect the environment. And to protect the environment, we need to tackle the climate crisis. So on that basis, I will speak about why this moment provides us with an opportunity to think again about how action on climate change can support both human and planetary well-being. And in order to speak about why this moment presents us with an opportunity, I will first of all speak about some of the effects of lockdown, which have emerged as something of a bright spot. And secondly, on how we can respond to these developments with regards to action on climate change. First, on the impacts. So nitrogen dioxide emissions, a major air pollutant, which is closely linked to industrial activity and decreased by as much as 40% across Europe as things came to a halt. Pollution, improved air quality. Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air estimates that the cleaner air which we had during lockdown avoided 11,000 deaths from air pollution in Europe. In New York, carbon monoxide emissions shrank to half their usual levels.
Oh, hi, Margaret. We might have connection.
Traffic led to clearer waters in places, for example, such as Venice's canal. Thailand endangered leatherback turtles.
I think we're just having some connection issues as we're all doing this from home. Not unusual for a Zoom. Margaret, can you hear us? And I'll see if we can try again.
Hello? 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 I hear you.
You're on mute now, James.
Sorry, Margaret, we'll leave the video off in order to let you, perhaps the signal will be better. We can hear you clearly, so we'll leave the video off. I think there was some connection issues with the internet.
Okay.
Sorry,
I was just saying that in Thailand, the endangered leatherback turtles had the highest nest counts in 20 years, coming after 5 years with no nests at all. And that's not all. A recent study led by scientists from the University of East Anglia and Stanford University, published in Nature Climate Change, found that the daily global CO2 emissions fell by as much as 17% in early April, the largest drop in emissions since 2006. Now, this finding supports reports from the International Energy Agency that global CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion, the main source of greenhouse gas emissions, were about 5% lower in the first quarter of 2020 than in the first quarter of 2019. And they predict that the global CO2 emissions would fall by about 8% this year compared to 2019, the largest drop since World War II. And yet, regrettably, this massive reduction is not enough to curb the climate crisis. The United Nations Environment Programme estimates that a fall of more than 7.6% in CO2 emissions is needed every year until 2030 if the world is to meet the Paris Agreement targets. While this shows that the long-term transformations required to tackle the climate crisis would be colossal, the pandemic has also created a great window of opportunity, actually, for a global reset. Keeping lockdown restrictions, of course, to April 2030 is not a feasible long-term strategy. But a number of shifts that have been brought on by the pandemic has laid the groundwork for some of the transformations that are required. So as we start to come out from lockdown, we now have to choose to move forward on climate action at the same time as we are addressing the economic and societal impacts of the pandemic in order to use this opportunity productively to steer our societies towards a new paradigm that truly addresses the climate crisis. Because if we don't, we run the risk of going back to business as usual and losing many of the recent improvements we have seen. So I will now want to briefly talk about some of the responses in relation to action on the climate crisis. So just like the global health crisis, the climate crisis requires an individual to local to global response, which is guided by science, as well as the need to protect the most vulnerable amongst us. And this will inevitably be based on political willpower to make long-term transformations that are required. So this moment has forced us to dramatically change our individual behavior in order to protect ourselves and those around us. And we have done that to a degree that most of us would never have experienced before or even think would be possible just a few months ago. So the pandemic has made our individual actions more visible than ever before, but it has also revealed that large-scale collective action to societal challenges is possible. So an equally dramatic and sustained shift in our individual behavior that is in harmony with nature and the environment will be needed to tackle the climate crisis and protect our environment. Now, on a global scale, there is a massive opportunity now to restructure economies in such a way that the true value of nature and the environment are taken into account. We need long-term recovery strategies that value the environment as the overarching framework within which we all exist, and not merely as an economic resource. A much more substantive shift from fossil fuel combustion to clean, renewable energy sources for energy generation is definitely needed now. Although some progress has been made in deploying renewable energy technologies over time, much more still needs to be done. Because even in 2017, coal, oil, and gas accounted for up to 81% of the world's total primary energy supply. And there are still plans currently to build new coal-fired power plants and oil and gas infrastructures in several countries around the world. Even in countries such as Norway, where almost all the electricity generation now comes from hydropower, they still often rely heavily on profits from fossil fuels and to fund welfare systems and pension schemes. And a recent report published by Imperial College London Business School and the International Energy Agency reveals that just despite renewable energy outperforming fossil fuels financially, total investment in renewable energy is still well short of the levels needed to put the world's energy system on a sustainable path. But we can seize this moment to increase investments in existing and emerging clean energy technologies and create jobs that would accelerate the pace of decarbonization. Governments could choose to take advantage of the current low oil prices to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies and raise the price of carbon for sectors which currently don't bear the full cost of emitting greenhouse gases. This moment also presents a window of opportunity for government and organizations to implement policies that will tackle the climate crisis and address the deep vulnerabilities and inequalities, some of which Helen spoke about, that exist in our societies and in our urban way of life, which has been made a lot more visible by the pandemic. And these policies are wide-ranging, one of which includes expanding the space allocated for pedestrians and cyclists, which many cities from London to New York to Barcelona and Milan are aiming to do now as lockdown restrictions are being lifted. So in conclusion, this moment provides us with opportunities for a great reset. And my hope is that we choose to create a world that has at its core the health and well-being of people, as well as the health of the planet. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Margaret. That was really really interesting and really helpful in terms of thinking about this, as you say, from a kind of planetary and climate change perspective. Perhaps if we can bring everyone back in with video, we'll have a go. I know, Margaret, that you've got some connection, maybe some slow connection issues, so that's no problem. We can deal with that as we go. So I guess we've got some time now to have an open discussion, and I just want to start by talking about, Sue, what your book touches on heavily, which is using gardening and nature as a tool for dealing with trauma and situations perhaps like we've had in lockdown. And I should say, not just lockdown, but many have gone through perhaps traumatic health crises related to COVID, and of course we've had sadly bereavements across the country. Your book starts by talking about your grandfather Ted May, who was a POW during the First World War, and he used he actually took part in a kind of program when he returned in relation to horticulture. I mean, could you talk a little bit about that and how it helped him, and maybe how it relates to now and thinking about trauma?
Yes, absolutely. No, Ted's story was very important, and I grew up with knowing about this, but it was only when I came to research the book that I fully understood actually how much the different ways in which contact with nature, actually connectedness with nature, I would say, more than contact, because we can sort of be out in nature but be oblivious, have our headphones on or whatever. So it's about connectedness, but also working with the natural growth force, which I mentioned in my introduction. And I think that if we're thinking about trauma and loss, I think I want to actually pick up on something Helen spoke about, which is the need to feel safe in nature. Urban parks, we can't just we can't roll out a kind of one size fits all, and there are a number of things that help people more than others, and the most important thing is a feeling of safety, and that can derive from what landscape designers call a combination of prospect and refuge, so that we've got good sight lines, we can see if somebody might be coming at us, but there's also somewhere a sense of some kind of refuge that's safe, that doesn't make us feel somebody might be lurking in the bushes. And that's been very important in the projects I've studied that were working directly with veterans today. And many of those are in walled gardens for that reason, actually. And that's a kind of crucial place where you start from, is that sense of safety. Beyond that, actually, the other thing that's very, very important is the amount of biodiversity. And this was illustrated in some research by Richard Fuller in Sheffield, where actually the more biodiversity there is, the more restorative a landscape is, or a garden is. And that we can think about what reasons that might be, but again, it's not this one size fits all. Just a kind of bit of green lawn is not enough, and particularly now when we're thinking about how do we repair nature, actually there are other reasons apart from our mental health that we need to be doing this. So that's very important. I think just going back to what you're saying, James, about trauma and loss, the other aspect of working in gardens and observing nature and having that sense of connectedness is it gives us a way of understanding the cycle of life. A garden is full of life, but there's also a lot of death in it. And the same with the seasons. I mean, what was remarkable was that for us, the crisis started in spring. So we could all tap into that tremendous sense of growth in spring, but we also have to let it go. So there's always an element of grief, little losses and grieving, but it puts it in a natural context. And I think when we've got so out of touch with nature, and also when death and dying and many of the rituals that are part of it have got slowly eroded, really, that can be very, very helpful for people.
Yeah, I mean, Helen, thinking about that and actually what it means practically, I mean, in Sue's book, she mentions a few programs, and I mentioned that her grandfather had that program after the war. I mean, from a policy response and thinking of the centre and its kind of what it suggests should happen, does this mean that we're going to have to see more kind of funding towards specific programs? It's not just about saying to people, you should go garden. First of all, many people don't have gardens, but also, like you say, some spaces aren't appropriate for people that are suffering with mental health. Does this mean that we're going to have to see a bit more of more funding and a kind of, I guess, a policy response?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things there. I think just on the point of what we might do going forwards, and I really like that aspect of what Sue's been talking about in terms of the kind of optimism and hope that some of the aspects of green spaces can bring, and also the blue spaces. I think, James, you were telling us offline about one of the nice things for you in lockdown has been the cygnets being born on the water that you live in, and I think just that idea of replenishment and optimism and that life is continuing around us is really helpful. But yeah, I think in terms of the policy, I think there is clearly, potentially some benefit in things like community gardening projects or making allotments cheaper for people so people can have more access to space. And I think that's useful for the kind of access to the natural benefits, as Sue was talking about, but also because it allows you to interact more with other people and the kind of the social support benefits that come from that. So I think we would certainly want to protect, and as Sue said, maybe enhance existing green spaces, so that as a priority, so that people do feel more able to access them and feel safer in them, and particularly thinking about people with disabilities, and to make sure they really are accessible, where, you know, in the future, if we can't get there on public transport, we have to drive a lot and that's not allowed, how will we be allowing people to use them? And thinking a bit more carefully about those restrictions. So, I mean, early on, it probably wasn't understandable in terms of social distancing, but it was a bit unfair on people who didn't have their own garden or outdoor space to prevent them from standing for more than 5 minutes in a park. So, you know, thinking in the future as we move perhaps into other lockdowns about how we might do that, I think is going to be really important, and how we design the spaces going forwards. So I think those are important, and I think, yeah, the idea of the individual differences is really important. So we can't just assume that, yeah, prescribing going out and being outside and having more opportunities to garden is definitely going to increase people's mental health. As I said, it's going to be clearly variable across people, and there's some really interesting work from King's on that, coming out of Andrea McKelly's group, who have this kind of urban mind app where they get people to use their phone and take pictures of where they are, and talk about kind of on several times a day how they're feeling in different spaces, and they found that actually some people, particularly people who generally are more impulsive, actually find spending time outdoors and in natural settings more relaxing, and improves their mood more than people who don't have generally being more impulsive generally. So I think that clearly that and other studies suggest there are likely to be different benefits between people, and I think it's really important to remember that although natural spaces may be beneficial, there are lots of other things that can be really important for our mental health, which we can think about alongside that. So just having somebody to discuss our problems with, just one person that we feel is supporting us, living, as I say, in a society where we feel supported by the neighbours around us, and the culture, and, you know, even basic things like just having enough money to have somewhere safe to live and sleep and be able to eat. All those things are clearly important, that we need to think when we're thinking policies about all of those aspects.
And Margaret, you spoke about some of the sort of presents an opportunity to think about the climate crisis, and Sue's book talks about restorative, how nature can be restorative. In some of them, what you've presented, it sounds like, well, we know that there's been a drop in emissions, and I'm thinking that often we've talked about climate anxiety, so people being anxious and actually being affected by the size of the climate crisis and what it presents. Yeah. I mean, do you, Margaret, think that this does present an opportunity not just to tackle the climate crisis, but actually to do it in a kind of positive way, to actually see the benefits for ourselves and perhaps even our mental health?
I think it does. I think this moment presents us with quite a lot of opportunities. So the improvements we've seen in air quality and the significant reductions in CO2 emissions that we've seen during the lockdown has revealed that our individual actions to stop pollution or to reduce our carbon footprint can have a ripple out effect. So it can ripple out and yield a collective impact, right? So it's an impact that is large scale. And so we, for example, in terms of transportation, coming out of lockdown, organizations could plan better in terms of organizing meetings and summits and conferences remotely. And so if we do that or commit to doing that, we could see a significant drop in our carbon footprints because our international travel would also drop. And even currently, some of that is already happening. So particularly during lockdown. So For example, there were so many conferences and summits that were held online. One particular example that comes to mind is the European Geosciences Union General Assembly. And this is a summit that would normally, this is a conference that normally takes place in Vienna, but it was done online. And there were even more participants this time than there normally is engaging with the conference. The climates, the Petersburg climate dialogue was also done virtually. So all of this has shown up in the reductions in our CO2 emissions. And going forward, these are simple, well, not simple, but these are policies that organizations could put in place to reduce our carbon emissions and help to tackle the climate crisis, and also help to improve our physical and mental well-being.
Yes, I would say something too. We're all,
you know, so there are so many other things as well that so many other policies that could be put in place. For example, even continuing working from home after the pandemic. That would also help in reducing our carbon footprints. So all these policy changes would have significant impacts, which we have already seen from lockdown. So I guess the main thing that has come out of this time with the improvements we've seen is how our collective action can have a wider impact. Yeah, so our collective damaging impact has already been seen in our environment, but what has been impossible until now to see is how our collective ability to address this impact is also significant when we commit to doing it together.
Yeah, it's been striking. So, Helen, did you wanted to come in there? And I know Sue after.
Just briefly to say, just picking up on one of the points from Margaret there, I think as well as the advantage for the climate to people not traveling as much for conferences globally and other kind of meetings, being able to do this online, I think it just also increases inclusivity in the sense that a lot of people who for childcare reasons or health reasons or other reasons may not have been able to travel to big meetings or events or other things can be more included because actually they can do that more comfortably from home during these periods. I think there are many social benefits to that as well, but I think we also have to remember that not everybody has internet access, and that's can also be discriminate against people in that sense. So thinking about different ways of including people, I think, is important. As a a big issue for children. A lot of children haven't had access to a computer and the internet during this lockdown, and therefore have been disadvantaged in that way. So yeah, I think there are many benefits from what we've been thinking about during lockdown.
What I wanted to add to what you both you and Margaret have said is that while these kind of adaptations we might make, at the same time do potentially disconnect us from our sort of, let's say, our team supports or direct contact with our colleagues and our whatever our for students as well. Sometimes they're teachers, and I think for what this has shown us, this crisis, is that the need to counterbalance that with a focus on the local, and to build that up and really reconnect people, because I think one of the things we've lost sight of is attachment to place, actually, the importance of attachment to place, and how stabilizing that can be for people. And I think in terms of what we're sort of talking about, mental health on the one hand and environment on the other, and I don't really see them as separate. I think that many of the mental health problems that we're seeing today, and that figures show that levels of depression, for instance, are 40% higher in people living in cities compared to rural counterparts, and anxiety is 20% higher. And in a way, our lifestyles have become unsustainable, as well as what's happening in the environment. So we are part of nature. So I mean, it's not surprising that this is us as well. I think in terms of the other theme I wanted to just sort of emphasize, because we've been talking about inequality, and we know that actually the parts of cities that suffer most from mental health problems and physical health problems are those the lowest income, and they almost always have the least amount of green space. And to get a feeling of how much difference it could make to introduce green space into those kind of communities, I just want to cite one bit of research which was carried out by the Centre for Research on Environment, Society and Health, based in Scotland. It was a large Europe-wide study, and it looked at neighbourhood amenities across the board, and it looked at all the confounding factors that play into income levels and mental health. And what was really striking in this study is the only intervention that made a significant difference was improving green space. And the team calculated that it could offset the inequalities in mental health that we see associated with low income and deprivation by as much as 40%, which is a huge amount.
Yeah, it's astounding. It's and I just because I was going to bring in, I will just say to our audience, do send in your questions. Some have come in. We're going to go to the Q&A in a moment. I want to say a special shout out. We just had the Constant Gardener on Twitter, who is the head gardener at the Salisbury District Hospital, has sent some fantastic images. He's been able to garden that, so he's the gardener there at Salisbury District Hospital, and they've got a fantastic garden.
James, I'll tell you, this unit actually appears in my book, and I'm also aware we haven't mentioned hospital gardens and how important they are. And there's been some very nice stories actually of their role in intensive care for people coming out of, when they've been suffering from COVID and on ventilators for a long time. And actually the dramatic effect just feeling the sun, seeing the plants has had on them. But the unit at Salisbury is part of the spinal injuries unit run by a charity called Horatio's for patients who are in hospital often for 6 to 9 months. And the gardens for them are a real lifeline. And in this crisis, even more so, because they haven't been able to have visitors. And it's been a safe and nourishing space to be, and that feels part of normal life as well. When you're very traumatized, it's very reassuring that nature's not been changed really, and to see nature flourishing is very important.
Yeah, I just and then we're going to go to this a quick question, so we'll try and keep it shortish before we go to the Q&A, so we have time. But you mentioned in your book, Sue, about cities and that the benefits of green space in urban environments have been there from the very beginning, whether it's ancient Rome or Mesopotamia. You mentioned John Evelyn, who
yes.
designed on London being far greener perhaps than the design that won out. Do you think that, and thinking about some of the practical things that governments and cities could do you think this sort of presents an opportunity? And I sort of put it to Helen as well, and to Margaret, I guess, from a sustainability perspective. I know there's been discussion about new bike lanes and taking this opportunity to put them in before people can reject them while the traffic's down. So do you think this kind of is an opportunity, particularly London, to think about if it's got the balance right, about green space and access to green space, so these not being private spaces but places where people can actually go? And perhaps
yes, I do, and I think it's that's crucial. And the benefits are also American research in Chicago and in Philadelphia has shown benefits in reducing crime, particularly gun crime there. But also people getting to know their neighbours. Once you create a safe space outdoors, that brings people together. To set this up, you do need thinking about funding. You need a mediator. You need a horticultural therapist. You need because it has to be done safely, and also people need to learn how to grow things very often if they don't know. But actually, once you get going, it's not that difficult. But it is very important to provide that aspect as well, that the sort of human the human side of it, the therapist who's involved is very, very important. So yes, I think it is an opportunity. I think one of the other projects I write about in the book is the Incredible Edible movement, which started in Todmorden. And what was very, very striking there was how quickly, local people took to it, and it involved planting food for people to share on planters, on pavements. One was outside the police station, on derelict land, and it transformed a town that was really struggling in the wake of the financial crisis in 2008. But particularly, they took gardening into schools. And I think if we're thinking about the future and people really understanding this, feeling it in themselves, I think community projects, school projects are going to be very, very important, actually. There's a phrase, plant blindness. It's been coined to say how many of us many people are currently growing up in this state of plant blindness, not noticing plants around them, not understanding their significance, that they recede into the background, and that you need a mentor, you need someone to introduce you to this world of plants and its fundamental role in our lives. It's where everything, all energy comes from, all everything in the globe really that sustains life derives from plants.
I just wanted to pick up on the point you made many times there, Sue, which I think is just really key, which is just how linked as well the kind of physical and green space and natural environment around us is linked with the social and the community, and how it's actually some of these adaptations and opportunities going forward are actually going to be probably most beneficial if we can really link the time spent in those natural beneficial environments with the opportunity to increase social interaction and that feeling of community. So I think that's a really important point, and thanks for so eloquently talking about that. Thanks.
Margaret, if we can go to the Q&A, maybe Margaret, a chance to bring you in here, because we've been asked by Andrew whether, and it kind of builds on what I've just mentioned, does this mean that we have an opportunity to put in more sustainable forms of transport, in particular cycle lanes and walkways? Do you think that's something that perhaps we could sort of twinned with the climate change discussion?
Yes, so again, it is something that I think we need to do now. And the fact that lockdown and social distancing and the pandemic and trying to curtail the spread and transmission of the virus has resulted in us being, more aware of the need to have pedestrian and cyclist space, more space allocated to pedestrians and cyclists within many cities to reduce the amount of people on public transport systems. So I think this moment creates that opportunity for us, and it's one of the things that, like I said earlier, that many cities have already started to put in place, and many of them are aiming to put that in place as going forward, and that would help with the pandemic as well as CO2 emissions. We see that it would immediately translate into a reduction in our CO2 emissions. And in addition to that, we could also put in place other policies as well that would help to improve our climate. And that would translate into nature and the environment. So things like investing more in public transport systems that rely more on electricity, and focusing also on renewable energy sources to generate the electricity for those public transport systems. So there are a lot of policies that could be put in place, in addition to allocating more spaces for pedestrians and cyclists in many cities that would help to reduce our carbon emissions, to improve our environment and also nature. And this moment provides us with a lot of opportunities. It's a moment that I think we can seize on to put in place a lot of changes.
And so, Helen, we've got another question here, maybe Helen and Sue. From Camilla, I can see the benefits of gardening for mental health, but doesn't it also play into the idea that we are neoliberal subjects responsible for solving our mental health problems? Yeah, I mean, do you want to speak to that, Helen, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I've already said during my talk and afterwards, that it's going to be beneficial for some people and not for others. And actually, a lot of the other things that happen around us also impact our mental health. So it's important that actually as a wider society, people feel supported and not discriminated against and not in an unequal position, and they do have support, they do have enough money to live and eat and be able to go about their lives without being attacked or threatened or discriminated against. So I think, there's an imperative on all of us to support people around us. And I think during lockdown, as Sue said, and we've talked about previously, actually the people around us, the neighbours around us and the local community, I think is really important. So I think it is, I think there's always something that we personally can do to improve our mental health, but I think a lot of it is really clearly intertwined with the people around us immediately and in the broader society. So
yeah, I'll just say something on that too. Yes, I think that's a very important point, and I think I go to some lengths in the book really to get the message across that this is not about just get out in the garden and you'll be okay, and it certainly isn't a one size fits all. That actually there needs to be a lot of planning and thoughtfulness that goes into making these things work. For instance, one of the examples I give in the book is of an autist, two different centres that were built with therapeutic gardens next door to each other, and one was for patients with a particular kind of learning disability that involved a lack of sensory, that they were understimulated in their sensory stimulations. The other centre was for people with very profound autism, and the gardens are completely different. The one garden is rectilinear and full of evergreens. Nothing changes in it very much, and the other is full of little interesting plants, interesting textures, interesting places that bring wildlife and a lot of diversity in it. So I think it's not about sort of just rolling this out in an unthinking way. And I totally agree with that question, that one has to guard against that. I mean, we've seen that happening with the climate crisis. It's as if, look after your carbon footprint, that's what you've got to do. And it does get pushed back at the individual. So I think it is very important that this is dealt with and thought about at a social and a political level. Yeah.
And we've had a question about how nature allows us to reflect on, or it's a kind of mirror on our own kind of ways in which we deal with things. And Sue, going back to, I think, your book, you spoke to a gentleman who had been struggling with mental health, and he had joined a program where it was a horticultural program, and you mentioned how it was the sensitivity of the plants and how they were fragile that made him, that allowed him, that sort of how it helped him on his recovery. So, and you mentioned about loss and the cycle of life. So does nature and plants do that? Do they kind of give us that way in to think about mental health in a different way?
I think they do, and it happens on different levels. There's first of all the effect of green space and feeling safety, which has a direct effect on our brain actually, and has been shown to reduce stress and anxiety, blood pressure, heart rate even, and actually to lower cortisol levels. So that's happening at that level. And then there's the sort of relational level, which is much more of a psychological level. And one thing that was fascinating to me in interviewing people and on different kinds of projects with different kinds of mental health problems were the different relationships they formed with plants. So yes, you're right, this particular young man, for him it was the vulnerability of the plant, and him seeing that vulnerability needn't be a disaster, that these plants hang on, they survive, and that he could too. He felt very, very vulnerable indeed. For the veterans who were suffering from PTSD, it was the trees. Certainly in the initial phase, trees gave them a tremendous sense of safety and endurance, and actually seemed to allow them to reattach to life. It felt safe to attach to a tree before attaching to another person. That felt far too risky. So it's different aspects of nature we respond to according to where we are and what we're struggling with.
Well,
James, you've muted yourself.
Sorry, there you go. Can you hear me? We've come to the end of our hour. We just had a comment in. The point about nature, plants, flowers, etc., being a constant is really important. The point made by Sue, particularly within a climate of not knowing what's going to happen next. And I think that's a really good place to end, because I think one of the things about this crisis has been it's felt like it's changed week to week in ways, and our lives have changed in ways that we can't quite imagine. So that's a really important point to make. So it just leaves me to thank our panelists, Dr Helen Fisher, Dr Sue Stuart-Smith, and Dr Margaret Kadiri. A big thank you for joining us on the podcast. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Great to chat to everyone.